happened to be in Spain in 1986, I guess, on May Day, and there were mass demonstrations. There was a socialist workers demonstration, and there were 2 anarchist demonstrations. They couldn't get together, so they had 2 separate demonstrations going. My wife and I had to kind of decide which one we wanted to march in. Thought for us, you might go in one, I might go in the other. But that kind of sectarian attitude can be very self-defeating and destructive. It should certainly be overcome if the movement is to have relevance to today's struggles, and it does. So take what's been happening in Madison, Wisconsin in the last couple of weeks, which is pretty important. Substantial popular uprisings, struggling for workers' rights, defense of democracy, and so on. There are many elements involved, but some of them are, in fact, organized anarchist groups. So the IWW, the International Workers of the World, has been to some extent reconstituted after it was bitterly attacked, virtually destroyed by American progressives, by Woodrow Wilson and his associates many years ago, and it's revived. Not huge, but it's active and is among the elements participating in and energizing the popular movements that are taking place. So I don't think that we should be so defeatist in our picture of what these movements are and have accomplished. Now, the groups that call themselves anarchists, that's a different story. Now, they are of all kinds of imaginable types. There's nothing general to say about them, but I think the basic ideas driving concepts that have been at the heart of the major anarchist developments for well into the 19th century, these remain, are constantly revived. They're because they're very natural. They're the kinds of points of view and attitudes that come to the fore when groups of people interact and organize to achieve some liberatory goal. And insofar as the anarchist movements maintain a presence, they can contribute to that, and they can learn from it, and they should. Same as in the case of not speaking truth to power, but speaking as best we can with audiences that matter, with them, not to them, and learning from them and contributing what's possible.
Thank you very much. And so we can move on to the second. No, you have a question. You have a question? Oh, you wanted to follow up.
Maybe
Sorry.
a little follow-up since you have time. So if I understand the Chomsky left is anarchism without anarchist. No? It's anarchism without anarchist.
I think everybody's an anarchist.
Okay, yeah. But without self-styled anarchist. But anyway, you see, who reads our books? Who reads our books? I mean, there's still the question, you were slightly evasive. You see, the people who read our books actually, even your books, I think, are generally students and intellectuals. And it seems to me, one of my concerns, and I expressed it to you before, is the huge split between the intellectual left, the petit bourgeois intellectual left, and the workers whose concerns seem to be very different now. And there's a huge difference. You see, for example, in countries, when you complain about the far right, well, the far right does actually get the workers' vote in many places, you see, overwhelmingly. And the people who vote on the left tend to be, intellectuals, teachers, students, and so on. So there's a big split. There's a sort of a strange situation there.
Can be, but I'm speaking from my own experiences, mostly the United States, and England, the other place where I am often. I don't, to some extent I agree, but I don't think it's as sharp as that. I mean, I speak to trade union groups. They're working people, they read the books. My own background from childhood was with, my family was working class, mostly unemployed working class in the 30s. Very literate, high literary culture. Many of them never past elementary school, but they were going to Shakespeare plays, discussing the latest concert of the Budapest String Quartet, reading Freud and Steckel, and debating fine points of psychiatry, reading, of course, all the left literature. That's pretty typical of working class culture. And it goes right back to the 19th century. You go back to the 19th century, there was, both in Britain and the United States, and it was also true of the radical workers in France and Germany, they had a high level of intellectual culture.
Yes.
And were reading serious material. In fact, part of their condemnation in their own, they had their own working class press. It's quite lively. The press in the United States, for example, it was written by Irish artisans from Boston, or young women from the farms who went to the textile mills. But one of their complaints was that the industrial system was destroying their intellectual culture. In fact, one of the major activities of left intellectuals in the 1930s was to reach out to the general public with science, mathematics, high culture, workers' education. A lot of that has declined, but it doesn't have to disappear. And I don't think it totally has disappeared. I mean, a lot of the, the mail I get and the people who show up at talks are people without much, people by now, everybody's gone to high school at least, as distinct from my own family, but without advanced degrees, people are just interested. I don't disagree with what you're saying. There is more of a break than there ought to be, but it doesn't have to be, and I think it can be overcome.
Well, I'm just going to put in a little word of disagreement, because it seems to me that perhaps whoever said that, the workers of that generation said that one of the things is they're destroying our culture. Well, since then, they have destroyed their culture. And there is now a popular culture that is much more powerful than existed then. I mean, with television, with all of that, then in that period. There's a popular culture which distracts from reading books. And I know in France, for instance, in the 50s, you had popular theater, which was doing very good quality for people, mostly sponsored by the Communist Party and municipalities. That's practically disappeared because the working class has become immigrants who are not interested in that. And I've seen that in Saint-Denis, and there have been efforts to keep it up, and it just isn't working that. There is a real problem here. Maybe in the United States it's paradise, but here there is a problem.
But I think what you're describing about the dumbing down of the culture holds with the educated culture too. Students in graduate school don't read either. I mean, that's a change. There has been a general decline in reading, inquiring, going to libraries, talking. There's an atomization in society, but I don't think that's particularly working class. And these are people we're talking to as well. If reading is disappearing, fine, let's give talks. Most of the talks I give. Most of the books, mine at least, are just collected talks. It's almost entirely talks. I mean, I very rarely sit down and write a book. Sometimes I do.
You pointed out to the fact that there was a care for culture in the working class at the time. And to come back to anarchists, they did this very deeply at heart. And when you walk through France, you see Bourses du Travail, and those were places where anarchists were organizing, and there used to be classes given there, popular universities. And today, I know, but today, in the United States, you know very well, much better than me, but you have people like Glenn Beck that are monopolizing media, that are producing a mass culture that is very disruptive for the mind. And this is a serious matter, I think.
That's true, but I think it's also true right through the level of graduate school. Yeah.
Well, okay, now maybe it's about time to move on to the second question, second session, which is absolutely related to the first, which is concerning intellectual life and education. So, Jean, do you want to start it?
Yeah. My question is a bit long, but I think it's quite a central concern of many people. 40 years ago, you had a televised debate on the Dutch TV with Michel Foucault, probably the most influential contemporary French intellectual. You said that you had never met anybody so amoral. And indeed, he is widely viewed as the main defender of postmodernism and moral relativism. But what is wrong with that? Don't you see that ethical norms vary widely across space and time? Slavery, subjugation of women, repression of homosexuals have been accepted in many cultures and still are. Here, it is a scandal to make caricatures of the Holocaust, but it is considered admirable to make caricatures of the Prophet. In Iran, it's the other way around. The terrorists of the Israelis are the freedom fighters of the Palestinians. Muslims think that their religion is truly universal, and Christians think likewise, but for their religion, while secularists think secularism is the only solution. Isn't truth itself, including scientific truth, always the effect of regimes of truth, as Foucault called them, that are inextricably linked to power? Isn't there something, both parochial and imperialist, in asserting one's own value system as being, quote, truly universal, unquote? If there are truly objective and universal moral norms, how do you discover and justify them?
I'll give you the second question also. Yeah. Your thoughts on education and university are very rich and inspiring, and you certainly take place among philosophers of education. But one might fear that libertarian ideals in education and appeals to creativity could, if pressed too far, deny children, especially for children coming from economically and culturally poorer families, could deny them access to skills and contents that should be transmitted and taught systematically and rigorously. Could it be then, as Hannah Arendt taught, that political progressivism presupposes a dose of pedagogical conservatism?
Let's start with moral relativism. It's a little difficult to discuss. It's a little bit like discussing skepticism. There are no skeptics. You can discuss it in a philosophy seminar, but no human being can in fact be a skeptic. They wouldn't survive for 2 minutes if they were, so they're not. And I think pretty much the same is true of moral relativism. There are no moral relativists. There are people who profess it, who can discuss it abstractly, but it doesn't exist in ordinary life. And to sharpen the discussion a little, we should recognize that the concept moral relativism ranges over quite a broad spectrum. So there's a form of moral relativism which is totally uncontroversial. Of course it's true. There are, as to quote this, there are ethical norms that vary widely over space and time. That's just an observation of fact. Nobody denies that. Similarly, every other aspect of humans varies quite widely. So, for example, human visual systems can vary quite widely in the way they function, depending on early experience. Actually, it's been shown by experiment, not with humans, but with other animals with essentially the same visual system, that you can change them radically just by early